Illinois ratified the ERA. There, I think we had the Me Too movement and a new energy around women in politics and women's issue in politics. So now we actually have 37 ratifications. So if we have one more state, we'll have 38, which is what you need for the ERA to become part of the Constitution. It's not a foregone conclusion, though, because of the deadline, there will be legal and political fights about the significance of the 1982 deadline with regard to the validity of the two ratifications that we've already had, and the third, which I think is easily on the horizon in the next few years. So, and just getting back to what I was saying about the politics of motherhood, this actually really surprised me when I saw this statistic. But as it turns out, today, 86% of women have given birth by the time that they're 44 years old. And that's actually, and I guess, and I know I'm a mother, but in the circles that I move in, this seemed like a very high percentage to me. But in any case, it's an interesting one. This was a number that had declined actually from the 70s until around 2006, but it seems like it's climbing back up. And yeah.
So they're saying that women over 40 are having babies?
No, what they're saying, it's counting, if you count everyone who's now 44, have you ever given birth at all, right? It's not, have you given birth in your 40s, but have you ever given birth from, whenever you were of childbearing age until now? And that's to say that this is a very large majority of women in this generation who are actually mothers. And also, I mean, there's similar data about how women in this age group, vast majority, are also in the workforce, right? And so I think a central issue for how we make meaning out of what gender equality can and should mean has to address the problem of working motherhood. And if we want to think about what equal rights has traditionally meant, right? Under the frameworks that were developed in the 1970s by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, there was a real emphasis on prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex, right? So you don't want the law to make distinctions between men and women or treat men and women differently. That is probably the most important contribution of Justice Ginsburg and the legal feminists who stretch the Equal Protection Clause to cover gender and discrimination against women. But I think it's also very important to note that if we're actually going to address the issues of working motherhood, the simple guarantee that there's no discrimination on the basis of sex is probably not enough. And the non-discrimination right has been really important. It's been very important for fighting stereotypes. It's also been very important for the general principle that all human beings should be free from irrational and bigoted forms of discrimination. So that's the idea of non-discrimination has also been extended now to many other groups, including LGBTQ individuals and various other vulnerable groups. And of course, the idea of non-discrimination was not invented in the United States with the idea of sex discrimination. It really originates in the concept of race discrimination, which is central to the way that the 14th Amendment has been interpreted really from the beginning. But at the same time, what I find really interesting here is that if it's true, so with so many women in the United States, very vast majority in our generation who have become mothers, it's really tragic that the ERA fails because it's seen to be unfriendly to mothers, right? And it's tragic that the interests of wives and mothers were deployed as a way of arguing against something that's obviously about, or should be about, the emancipation of women. And I want to mention where I started, that in most other countries in the world and in many European countries, the rights of mothers or the protection of motherhood or the state support of motherhood has actually gone hand in hand with the constitutional meaning of the guarantee of sex equality that you find in European constitutions worldwide. So I want to say a little bit about that. And perhaps the best way to think about it is by coming back to the 14th Amendment for a moment, right? Because we mentioned that even though it says equality, there seems to be a refusal in Section 2 to recognize women's fully equal status with men. And so why? Why does the 14th Amendment not guarantee totally equal legal status to women? Is it just an accident, or is it a deliberate exclusion? And I think that it's not that simply that the drafters, who are mostly or all male, forgot that there were women. Yeah, go ahead,
Wouldn't
Chair.
it be also a matter of economics?
Mm-hmm.
Because the federal government has a proportional dissemination of funding
Mm-hmm.
to the states. So therefore, if you have your smaller and your larger states, so therefore if you count people differently, like
Mm-hmm.
creative accounting, the federal government doesn't need to subsidize in the same proportional kind of way, because it's creative math, so to speak.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So when we talk about Section 2, they're really talking about punishing. I mean, what this section is really about is punishing certain states that deny the right to vote to the newly enfranchised African Americans, right? And one question is, though, but by framing that, they really make it clear that they're the only holders of those rights, or the only people who count, are men. And expressing then, of course, our whole constitutional framework that exists until now. Women are citizens, but we don't assume that women are fully equal legally or in status to men. Why not? I mean, part of the answer has to do with the implications of what it would mean in, like, with regard to the right to vote and apportionment. But I think there's a deeper and more general set of issues with regard to women's exclusion from full legal and political equality at this moment, which the Supreme Court addresses.
It's a touch screen. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. In the first set of cases in 1873 that actually interpret the 13th and 14th Amendments, the Civil War amendments from the US Constitution. So this is a notorious case, Bradwell versus Illinois. Myra Bradwell had studied law and kicked butt on the bar exam, but the Illinois Supreme Court said she could not be admitted to the bar because she was a woman, or the state of Illinois excluded married women from admission to the bar, even if they passed the exam. And the US Supreme Court explains that even though we have the 14th Amendment, practicing law is not a privilege and immunity of citizenship. And what's interesting, so they say it's fine for states to deny women entry into the legal profession, right? It's not unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, equal protection, privileges and immunities, whatever language in the 14th Amendment you're going to look at. And one of the justifications for this, though, is that you can't have women who have fully equal status because women are actually subsumed by the legal status of their husbands. And it has to be that way. Women cannot make and enforce contracts because what would happen if women made and enforced contracts? And Justice Bradley's concurring opinion, more so than the majority opinion, really lays out the logic behind this position. So if you look at what he says, the civil law, as well as nature herself, has always recognized a wide difference in the respective spheres and destinies of man and woman. Man is or should be woman's protector and defender. The natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. The constitution of the family organization, which is founded in divine ordinance as well as in the nature of things, indicates the domestic sphere as that which properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. Okay? And I'm going to ask you to try, okay, so we're going to do an exercise. Try to ignore the sexism of the quote for a minute. I know it's hard, but try to ignore the sexism for a minute to try to make sense of the worldview, right? Because I don't think the worldview is just sexism, although that's a huge part of it. If you look at what he then continues to say, the harmony, if not to say identity, of interests and views which belong or should belong to the family institution is repugnant to the idea of a woman adopting a distinct and independent career from that of her husband. So firmly fixed was this sentiment in the founders of the common law that it became a maxim of the system of jurisprudence that a woman had no legal existence separate from her husband, who was regarded as her head and representative in the social state, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about what this means, because I think we often look at it and just see, oh God, there's divine ordinance sexism, like it's just a bunch of drivel and we don't need to pay attention to it. But I actually think what he's saying is actually quite important, because women's exclusion in the 14th Amendment has to do with what is the society's plan for how to raise the next generation of citizens. The plan is women stay home and take care of the household, and men go out and have a legal existence and make and enforce contracts and vote and run the polity, right? Because every society has to have a plan by which the next generation gets raised. This is our plan, right? And of course, part of the justification then for excluding women is that if every constitutional system is actually interested not just in setting up institutions, but setting up institutions for a society that plans to perpetuate itself, because a constitution, of course, is supposed to outlive the people who are writing it. It creates fundamental law that's transgenerational, right? And so this is the society's plan for how we're going to perpetuate ourselves. Of course, it's gender unequal, but it's a framework that works in the sense that if you keep women at home and men in economic and political life, it is a system that is going to ensure that somebody's around to raise and educate those kids. And of course, a lot of this changes, right? That is what our plan becomes. And of course, but the fear here is what's going to happen to this plan if women start enforcing contracts and getting jobs and becoming lawyers and being in Congress, right? Then our plan is going to fall apart. Then who's actually going to raise the children, right? And so that's why we have to keep the plan intact. And of course, this also then draws attention to the huge problem with anti-discrimination as a solution. We can wake up today and call mothers and fathers equal, right? We could say they now have legal rights. Like we could say get rid of the sexism. But it doesn't necessarily mean that by saying everyone's equal, you're then going to have a new plan that works pretty well and is up and running without a lot more work thought into how we're going to construct that plan. And I think this comes into sharper focus if you look at 20th century constitutions, particularly the ones that grew up in Europe after World War I and World War II. Because after World War I and World War II, one fundamental problem, well, there were many, but one huge problem in World War I and World War II in countries like Germany was that the male population had been decimated. And because so many men were dead, it became really clear that women actually had to do everything. They had to work and raise children at the same time in order for the nation to be able to rebuild itself. And because they kind of understood that, and you see it very clearly in the Constituent Assembly debates, gender equality becomes a fundamental political principle. And it doesn't just mean non-discrimination. It kind of also means we need a new plan for how this nation is going to get rebuilt. And so if you look at, for example, and what's interesting also after World War II, that starting with the German Constitution, 1918, then the 1948-49, there were only 4 women, largely because it's a much smaller constituent assembly. The one that wrote the Weimar Constitution after World War I was actually much larger, had hundreds of people in it, and 10% were women. You have 4 women in writing the German Basic Law, which is the constitution that's currently in force in Germany. And these women came from all sides of the political spectrum. So socialists, Christian Democrats, and what's very interesting also is that it's not partisan politics in terms of their advocacy for constitutional sex equality, as well as the advocacy for other provisions that are in the Constitution. And I think it's important to note, and if you want to know a little bit more about their work, I highly recommend this made-for-television German movie that dramatizes their experience of getting gender equality into the German constitution. It wasn't an easy feat. And so, there's pop culture with RBG in the movies here and the German founding mothers in their movies. And I highlight the German example because what's very interesting is not only that they wrote a provision in 1994 that said men and women shall have equal rights, and then in 1994 they added an amendment that you see in blue that the state shall promote the actual implementation of equal rights for women and men and take steps to eliminate disadvantages that now exist. Right? That's a late 20th century intervention. But if we're just looking also at the post-war experience, 1949, when they write men and women shall have equal rights, a very common feature of constitutions around the world. Section 6.4, every mother shall be entitled to the protection and care of the community. Right? And in Germany, they see equal rights for women as going hand in hand with making sure that mothers get the protection of the community because of this understanding that they need a new plan. If you're going to actually rebuild a nation after war, women are going to work and have kids, and there needs to be some state support for that new arrangement that's different from the arrangement that's celebrated in the Bradwell versus Illinois case. And I just also want everyone to know that we're not just talking about Germany, that it becomes very common in the 20th century for constitutions to explicitly mention gender, sex, even pregnancy and marital status, sexual orientation, these categories, gender categories in constitutions. So this is the Constitution of South Africa, the Constitution of Ecuador, which is a 21st century constitution, have a provision that's specifically refer to equal rights for male and female citizens. There's another provision in addition to that prohibits discrimination, and you'll notice there are many categories of discrimination, not just sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, but also things like cultural identity, socioeconomic condition, HIV carrier, disability. They list many, many different forms of discrimination that are prohibited by the Constitution. But in addition to that, there's also something special in the Constitution for mothers, right? So Article 43 in the Ecuador Constitution also says that pregnant and breastfeeding women have special rights. Free maternal health care services, facilities needed for recovery after pregnancy and during breastfeeding. These are all constitutional rights in Ecuador. And I give you these examples because I think it's important to reflect on all the different ways in which constitutions think about problems of gender inequality as both problems of discrimination on the one hand, and also problems having to do with lack of support for the sources of women's disadvantage. And sometimes that lack of support is itself a form of discrimination, but in my view, it's not really just discrimination that's the problem. But it's our inability to have created political and social institutions that actually deliver a plan for social and biological reproduction, how we're going to raise the next generation. The old plan that we can sort of make fun of in the Bradwell decision is mom at home. But we actually have not, now we've just said that's sex discrimination to say mom at home, but we haven't actually gone the step further of creating the social and political institutions necessary to have something other than mom at home as our plan. And what that means is that if you don't have something other than mom at home, we revert back, and women, by virtue of maternity, end up being severely disadvantaged, both politically and economically. And I think that's something to which there ought to be a solution that should not be partisan. This is something that should be of interest to women on all sides of the political spectrum. And just to give an example, this is not a constitutional example, but I think it's quite telling that a few years ago, 2015, the Supreme Court decided a case called Young versus UPS. And it was a case in which a woman who was pregnant asked for light duty, an accommodation, and she didn't get it. She wanted to, she had to do a lot of heavy lifting in her job, and she wanted an accommodation during her pregnancy where she would only be lifting things under 20 pounds. And UPS refused to give her that accommodation, and she sued, claiming that it was pregnancy discrimination. And it may seem like a no-brainer to you that she should get the accommodation, but it was actually a very complicated question under the pregnancy discrimination law. that we have in the United States, because we just have to treat pregnant women the same as the way we would treat anyone similarly disabled or similarly able or unable to work. And the question is, if an employer then refuses light duty to everyone, then it's okay for the employer to also refuse light duty to the pregnant worker. Her case is complicated by the fact that there are some men who are getting light duty, and those are the ones who are injured on the job. And the employer is claiming, if you get injured on the job, then of course we give you light duty. But if you get injured off the job, like you get pregnant or you get into a skiing accident, then we're not going to cover that. We're not going to accommodate that. Right? So it's a complicated case, but what I want to point out about the case, without getting into the details of the anti-discrimination framework that the court analyzes there, what I found most interesting about the case was the way in which it brought both feminist groups, women's rights organizations, in support of the pregnant worker, as well as pro-life conservative groups in support of the pregnant worker. And the logic is simple. If women are disadvantaged by virtue of maternity, they are going to be incentivized to just not have children and get abortions, or even before we think about abortion, just not reproduce at all. If becoming a mother is actually an economic disaster for those who choose to become mothers. And I think this just shows the extent to which concerns about social reproduction should be a bipartisan issue. It's not an interest group issue, but it's something that I think can and should unite women in politics from across the political spectrum, as it has in many other countries where constitutional equal rights movements have actually been successful, unlike ours. And I want to just kind of end by bringing it back to local politics, because I know many of you are running for positions locally or at the state level. You'll notice that Governor Cuomo made a statement in March on International Women's Day saying that it is unacceptable that more than 100 years after women won the right to vote in New York State, our Constitution still does not ban discrimination based on sex or afford women equal protections under the law. That needs to end this year. We must pass the ERA this legislative session to ensure New York continues to serve as the beacon of progress for this nation. So even though New York ratified the federal Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s, New York never actually added an Equal Rights Amendment to the New York State Constitution. What we have in the New York State Constitution right now just says no person shall, because of race, color, creed, or religion, be subjected to any discrimination in his or her civil rights. But it doesn't mention sex or gender. And there is now a bill, and it actually passed the Assembly quite recently. It was sponsored by Assemblywoman Rebecca Seawright. And it's a very simple bill that just adds one word to what we already have in the New York State Constitution. So it inserts the word sex, which I put in red there so that you can see what the constitutional change will be. But meanwhile, it hasn't passed the Senate. In the Senate, I've been involved with Liz Krueger's office. Liz Krueger's the state senator who's been working and sponsored this bill. This is the existing bill, and there are other drafts that I've been on the team of attorneys working on. But another draft, another possibility is to have something much more expansive, sort of like the examples from Ecuador that I showed you. Equality of rights shall not be denied or abridged because of race, color, creed, religion, national origin, citizenship, marital status, age, gender, sex, pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, physical or mental disability, other immutable or scriptive characteristic, or like grounds for discrimination, exclusion, or disadvantage, right? So this is what's known as the more expansive ERA. And you can try to think about, as a woman in politics, I think the solidarity with all the vulnerable groups is extremely important. On the other hand, this has this kind of simplicity of saying we need to add sex to a framework that already has race in it. And I guess I would also just perhaps leave you with this, or we could use it as a topic for discussion. What are the relative advantages or disadvantages of focusing on sex or gender, or focusing on women even, versus focusing on all the different categories and groups with which women can be in solidarity. And so I think that one of the virtues of focusing on sex is that it really draws attention to the uniqueness of gender exclusion in the constitutional framework. That is, it's not just any old form of discrimination, or it's unlike other forms of discrimination in that it was actually a plan for how to grow the nation, right? It is, so if you think about sex discrimination as not just being about sexism, but about having a set of social arrangements, and then you see sex equality as not just end the sex bigotry, but a sex equality as a commitment to having new institutions that reconfigure what our social reproduction framework looks like, right? That makes it extremely different from almost everything else, although arguably it makes it very similar to race, because if you think of race as not just being about bigotry, but about the economic system of slavery and Jim Crow, right? Slavery and Jim Crow was absolutely 100% about bigotry, but it lasted for as long as it did and was sustained by people who did not think they were bigots because it was an economic framework by which the nation had a plan for survival. It was not a very, it was an immoral plan based on exploitation, but the idea is that it's been a framework rather that goes beyond discrimination and bigotry. And so if you think about it in those terms, you might think that having these kind of limited lists of prohibited categories makes more sense for a constitutional regime. And on the other hand, though, if we're focused more on this idea that each individual is entitled to be judged on their own merits without regard to a lot of irrelevant characteristics, then the solidarity with all these other vulnerable groups that are differently situated with regard to the sources of their vulnerability in a diverse democracy, perhaps this would be the more preferable framework. I will note one thing, though, and it's something that you see at work every time people have a discussion of the so-called inclusive ERA, right? This may look like a really exhaustive list to you, but if you compared that to this, right, you'll notice that in New York, nobody has really inserted socioeconomic condition or migratory status into the New York version, right? And it's not simply because we have forgotten. I think in part it's because sometimes there's an interest group politics that drives which groups get included and which don't get included, right? And if we really stick to the idea that really the constitutional prohibition of discrimination on grounds of sex or the constitutional rights of women should not be regarded as an interest group issue, but is actually something fundamental about women as half the population and women's role in reproducing the nation or reproducing the polity, reproducing New York, that might give us reasons to really focus on women's issues and appreciate the distinctiveness of those issues while also remaining in solidarity with all the other vulnerable groups that deserve legal protection. So I will just end there and open it up for discussion or questions. Yeah.
One quick question. The young lady, Young versus GPS, what was the outcome of her case?
So the outcome of her case was basically that the Supreme Court said that she had enough to proceed. It didn't mean she won. She had enough to proceed in litigation because for the lawyers in the room, the case had been dismissed on, I can't remember if it was an early motion to dismiss or a summary judgment. But the case had not gone to trial on the assumption that the employer would automatically win, because even if she could prove that she was not given the accommodation, the lower courts had taken the position that as long as she's treated the same.
CREWTV is a movement. We are civically re-engaged women, and this is the Seneca Falls Revisited virtual experience. It's CREW's Centennial celebration event commemorating 100 years of American women's right to vote. So go to CREWwomen.tv to get your subscription today.
boys think they can play sports better than girls, but I don't think that's true. And like in the old days, the men would go out and get the jobs, and the women would have to stay home and do all the housework and stuff. And I don't think that was fair either. That's the way it was. I couldn't help it.
My dear brother Silas, today began like any other day. The sun rose over the fields, lighting my sweet family's way to wakefulness. I prepared breakfast, tidied the house, took up my sewing, and gathered the children for our ride into town. My Sarah runs around like a little savage and does not want to wear any of the lovely dresses I make for her. I counted the blessings the good Lord bestowed on me and tried to remain calm while getting them ready.
See you.
Okay, now go. But all of this I accomplished with much impatience and an eye toward the clock. For a most out-of-the-ordinary event was to take place at 10 o'clock at the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel. It was a convention for the discussion of the rights of women. My dear friend and neighbor Ann Dewey showed me the notice in the newspaper. Oh, now I can see you raise your eyebrow and give me your stern look. And I beg you not to disapprove of me. But a public meeting for women is such a curiosity. And my beloved husband, Mr. Griswold, did not forbid it. So I made up my mind to go. I am only slightly anxious about letting Mr. Griswold take care of our children and our home for the next 2 days. Your loving sister, Lucy.
Years earlier, Lucretia Mott, a Quaker leader who had already earned a reputation for speaking out for the rights of slaves and women, traveled to London as a delegate to the World Anti-Slavery Convention. At the convention, Mott met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a newlywed who was there on her honeymoon with her husband Henry, also a delegate. Mott and the other women delegates caused an uproar on the convention floor. The entire first day, the men debated, not about the evils of slavery, but whether women should be permitted to participate. Finally, it was decided that they could remain silent in the gallery. The humiliation of this experience forged a lifelong bond between Mott and Stanton. They vowed to expand the crusade for women's rights after their return to America.
My dearest sister Lucy, you will be pleased to hear of my new position. I now have full responsibility for managing the mill. However, my increased duties have not kept me from doing my work against slavery. I was a little confused by your letter. What did you mean by women's rights? I have just returned from a church meeting where we were given more accounts about the terrible conditions of the slaves. They have no freedom or rights. Don't women already have rights? Men must work very hard to provide their wives with a home and security and to support their children. What more could women desire? Your friend Anne was always strong-minded, even when we were children. I'm surprised her husband still tolerates her. He must be a saint or too old and feeble to control her. Have I not told you that what men most prize in a woman is her affection? My Martha understands this, and it is truly the success of our marital bliss. I urge you to follow her ways. Your brother, Silas.
In the summer of 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton joined Mary Ann McClintock, Martha Wright, and Jane Hunt for afternoon tea in Waterloo, New York. Stanton, no longer infatuated with being a homemaker, recalled her feelings on that day. I poured out the torrent of my long accumulating discontent with such vehemence and indignation that I stirred myself, as well as the rest of the party, to do and dare anything. They decided to call the first Women's Rights Convention.
What a very good idea. We need some kind of a document that will set forth exactly how we feel about these things. Really?
One week later, they met at the home of Mary Ann McClintock to discuss a plan for presenting their grievances.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
They chose as their model the document which had brought charges against the King of England, the Declaration of Independence. The women called their document the Declaration of Sentiments, and it would indict an entire society.
Therefore, it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you my dear friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed... that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. He has withheld from her rights.
This is election day, and my brother is 21 years old. How proud he seemed as he dressed up in his best Sunday clothes and drove off in the big wagon with Father and the hired men to vote. I turned to Mary and I said, wouldn't you like to vote as well as Oliver? Don't you and I love the country just as well as he, and doesn't the country need our ballots? Then she looked scared, but answered, of course we do, and of course we ought, but don't you go ahead and say so, for then we would be called strong-minded.
He has taken from her all right in property, even to the wages she earns. He has made her morally.
I have earned enough to school me a while, and have I not a right to do so? Or must I go home like a dutiful girl, place the money in Father's hands, and then there goes all my hard earnings?
In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming to all intents and purposes her master. The law giving him power to deprive her...
As the Lord Christ is the head of the church and the head of the man, so is the man the head and governor of the woman. This is God's choice and should not be transgressed.
He has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her. He allows her in church as well as state, but a subordinate position.
Our colleges were never intended for the education of females. The male brain weighs more than the female brain. This proves that women are intellectually inferior and should be educated for different purposes.
He has usurped the prerogative of Jehovah himself, claiming it as his right to assign for her a sphere of action, when that belongs to her conscience and to her God.
I felt that I had found my vocation. I forgot God and did not know it, forgot philosophy and did not care to remember it. But alas, I forgot to get Bard's dinner. Not only once did I do this, but again and again. The fire went out or the bread ran over in the pans. while I painted and dreamed. Had the passion seized me before marriage, no other love could have come between me and art. But I felt that it was too late, as my life was already devoted to another object: housekeeping.
He has endeavored, in every way that he could, to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life.
Dear Silas, you sound more like Father than Father did when he was alive. I must confess, I am confused by all this talk of women's rights. My heart is inflamed as much with a fearful anxiety as it is stirred with new ideas. I never expected to see women speaking so eloquently and with such power in public. Yes, dear Silas, they spoke like men, or even better. Yet, I know I'm very happy in my own home with my wonderful children and loving husband. But what about my lovely Sarah? Should she stay home like I did while her brothers go off to college? Shouldn't a man want a woman who can think and is well educated to be his companion and raise his children? Your loving sister, Lucy. P.S. No need to fear, Silas. I have not signed any declaration. I could not be sure how Mr. Griswold would feel, so I held back. Oh, and by the way, Anne didn't sign either.
300 people attended the Convention for Women's Rights in Seneca Falls. Of these, 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Sentiments, including the African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass. This gathering demonstrated to those women unhappy with their status that they were not alone, and it proclaimed to the world that here were women and men willing to change the conditions and injustices which oppressed them. They knew their path would not be easy.
My dear Lucy, I urge you not to look away from your own little family circle for the means of producing moral and social reforms. You can be a guiding light within your home and should not participate in public demonstrations.
Amy, come back here.
Amy, you don't want to keep playing with us. Back with your mother on the blanket, okay?
I pray you still believe that women are far superior to men morally. That is why it is your duty to instill your children with those values our dear departed mother taught us. Your loving brother, Silas.
What do the ladies want? They have the best place and choicest titbit at the table. They have the best seat in the cars, carriages, and sleighs. And at the present time, with the prevailing fashion, one lady occupies 3 times as much space in the world as a gentleman. If there is any inequality or oppression in the case, the gentlemen are the sufferers.
Little did the critics and newspapermen realize that the negative attention they gave to the first Women's Rights Convention served to spread the flames of discontent to others. The issues, now hotly debated in the public arena, could no longer be ignored.
This meeting, as I understand it, was called to discuss women's rights. Well, I do not pretend to know exactly what women's rights are, but I do know that I have grown for 40 years, yea, for 50 years, under a sense of women's wrongs.
As far as marriages, well, my mom, she's a teacher and she works also, so does my dad. But she quit working for a while to stay home with us until my brother was in kindergarten and we were old enough to stay home alone and everything. And she had to put her career on hold. My dad could have done that too, I think.
Well, I would expect to, have her own profession, like I would have mine. And though I would expect the food to be on the table at the same time, So it's got to balance out on that.
You see how all the basketball games for boys, they always get on TV and the Dream Team and all that. But for girls, I mean, what do they get? They hardly get any recognition,
Well, they had a Dream Team for
girls. Yeah, but nobody really paid attention to them.
Yeah, they did.
No, they didn't.
Yeah, they did.
No, they didn't.
Yeah, they did.
No, they did not.
Mm-hmm.
No, don't tell me. They did not pay attention.
In the eyes of the law made by men, women were classified with minors, lunatics, and idiots. They could not own property, make contracts, sue, or serve on juries. A woman was only one husband away from poverty.
Dear Silas, I write with a sad heart the news of Uncle Edward's death. Unbeknownst to Aunt Grace, he had deeply encumbered himself in debt, and the creditors have claimed everything. Now she must leave the very house which her father gave to her. It frightens me to think that a woman who loses her husband may become destitute in an instant. What if something were to happen to Mr. Griswold? Then who would take care of us? I shouldn't permit myself to think such thoughts. I must confide in you that I will do everything in my power to secure a good education for Sarah, so she can be independent and realize her own self-worth. We have stopped buying sugar produced by slaves. It is my small way of helping the cause. Love, Lucy.
Dearest Lucy, I will miss Uncle Edward. He was always so much fun to be with, although he helped himself too much to the bottle. Surely Aunt Grace was aware of his drinking and financial extravagances. Perhaps Aunt Grace will remarry and thereby ensure the security of her family. Husbands are the best protection from poverty, even though they are not immortal. My boys are shooting up like cornstalks. I urge them to study hard so they can earn a living and support me when I'm too old to earn any more. My work keeps me so occupied that I worry that I do not spend enough time with them, although I do not know how much time they want to spend with me. Martha is still frail from the birth of Joshua. She looks forward to spending some time with you. Your loving brother, Silas.
The common experience of childbirth and child rearing bound most women together. They spent much of their adult lives pregnant, giving birth, nursing, recovering from births, and supporting their female kin and friends.
By God's grace, I have given birth to 10 children before my 34th year, and though 4 of them have not survived, I am still alive. With God's grace again, I will give life to this one, and he will not take mine. I pray that Jonathan will not take an interest in me again. I cannot bear much more.
Dear Silas, today is Sarah's 16th birthday. Where, my dear brother, do the years go? Sarah is very involved with herself. Oh, I know the stage will pass, but sometimes, she is impossible to be with. I took her to town to buy material for a silk dress. Her ideas about fashion differed from mine.
How about this one here? Oh, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hoskins.
We passed a woman wearing blues. I must say they are not very flattering to the hips. I told Sarah that I would relish the freedom of movement they give. Sarah declared that if I wore such a scandalous outfit, I wouldn't be welcome to visit her at school or tell anyone I was her mother.
My dear sister, mark my words, if women insist on wearing those vulgar fashions, the next thing you know, we will see them smoking tobacco. It is fortunate that your Sarah has not inherited her mother's radical notions. She will need to attract a level-headed young man for her husband, and no healthy member of the masculine sex would ever be attracted to a woman in bloomers. On a more serious note, I am daily more concerned about the great rift that grows between the North and South. I know that Eli is worried over whether he will be able to keep the factory running. So much talk of war, that I fear for all our sons and our country. Your loving brother, Silas.
That's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about. He can laugh.
When the Civil War came, women kept the farms producing and the factories running. They donned nurses' caps and marched to the battlefields to heal the wounded. They taught the children and kept the home fires burning. The leaders of the women's movement led the campaign for the passage of a constitutional amendment which would free the slaves. Women expected equal rights for the slaves and themselves after the war.
My dearest Martha, the sadness wells up in me as I write to you about the great loss we share with the death of my dear brother Silas. I hear very little from Eli and my sons. I have been comforted with Sarah's presence as she awaits the return of her husband. While we don't always hold the same opinions, we manage to have lengthy discussions to fill our lonely hours. Once the slaves are free, I believe the Negroes must have the vote to protect themselves from any more abuses. Sarah says that women must also get the right to vote. She feels if women would have a say in the laws of the land, then there would be no wars. Maybe she's right. I still feel that even if we have a say, who would listen to our voices? Martha, am I just growing old and tired? I wish we could be together now. With loving comfort, Lucy.
When the war ended, most abolitionists supported a constitutional amendment giving African American men the right to vote. They refused, however, to include a woman's right to vote, fearing it would be too controversial and would defeat their cause. This decision created a major split between those woman suffrage advocates willing to put their desires on the back burner and those unwilling to wait any longer for the basic civil rights of all women. The seed planted 20 years earlier in Seneca Falls still had not blossomed.
See, girls always put you down. Yeah, you always put us down. Not all the time. Not all the time? Well, see, look, you just put me down right there. Well, you're yelling at me for putting you down when you put me down, so it doesn't really matter. So both girls and boys say that, but it still means that girls are treated differently than boys. Yeah, true. Have you ever seen a girl president? No. Have you ever seen,
It'll never happen. I don't think it'll ever become equal.
I think it will. I think it will.
Unless we lose gender, it'll never.
See, he still thinks he has all the power, and it's not.
No, true. I'm not saying that men are overpowered. I just don't think it'll ever be totally equal.
I think it will.
My dearest Sarah, at 40, I know you feel you are too old to take advice from your dear old mother. But at my age, I feel I have earned the right to speak my mind about your daughter and my granddaughter. I sense that you and Charles are afraid that Hannah will be criticized and ridiculed if she enters the medical profession. I hope you will accept this money as my modest investment in Hannah's future. If your father were alive, he would have wanted this too. We must make sure our daughters have the same opportunities as our sons. I'm afraid I won't be around much longer to see all the changes that are yet to come. And yet, I can't help but think about how far we've come since that remarkable day in 1848, and how much of the road is still left to travel. Your loving mother.
CREWTV is a movement. We are civically CREWTV is a movement. We are civically